delighted to welcome our first guest and keynote of our Borrowed Time Summit, Bayo Akomolafe. I'm just going to read the text of Bayo's talk just to remind us of the invitation. And then I'll say a little bit about Bayo himself and get out the way as quickly as possible. A certain kind of dying. What happens when health, well-being and recovery are caught up with particularly troubling modes of corporeal production and imperial stabilities? What happens when unbothered continuity gets in the way of flourishing? In what sense might we consider death more than just a terminal point, a gift in this pandemic-inflected Anthropocene? In this talk, Bayo Akomolafe revisits dying as a decolonial opening and failure as an emancipatory cartography in modern territories of acting and becoming with the world. It might just take a certain kind of dying for us to be alive in a ravishingly different way. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Bayo Akomolafe, whose writings and recorded talks, and of course his own teaching, with, I know now, the second iteration of his course, We Will Dance with Mountains, I hope I've remembered that right, Bayo, is affecting so many of us so deeply and really helping to shift our own inhabitation of these themes. And Dr. Bayo Akomolafe is a philosopher, psychologist, professor and poet. He's a teacher and public intellectual renowned for his unconventional views on global crises, activism, and social change. So Bayo's talk is going to be followed by a Q&A where you can come and put questions to him directly. But in the meantime, all I can say is we're genuinely delighted to welcome you, Bayo. Really, really happy that you could join us and
Thank you,
have you opening our Borrowed Time Summit. So welcome, Bayo.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And I am delighted to be here with you all. I wish I could see you, but I'll make do with the faith that you are here and we're here together. Thank you, Matt, and everyone for this invitation. I'm in Lisbon right now. I'm losing light quickly. Even though we're in the same time zone with the UK. So I'm just gonna dive into it. But first to greet you all. I know these are very troubling times. And getting by is difficult. None of this is convenient. I must have undergone, gone through lots of rituals just to make it through the airport, to make it to Lisbon. It seems the world is radically different from the last time. And I know it's not just me feeling that way. Anyway, this is my final day in Lisbon and I'm heading home tomorrow. I missed my family. I was here for a series of talks. And I cannot wait to see my daughter, my son, my wife, my people. And I thought I would begin with some stories. But first of all, just to situate things, what I would like to share with everyone is something that I've called a certain kind of dying. And I've put that in slides. Slides are not my thing usually. But under the circumstances, I really feel called to use it. So I'm gonna switch the slides now so we can all share the beautiful work that I've done to impress you and to get on with this together. Can everyone see this? I'm just gonna believe that everyone can see this. Okay? So I call this a certain kind of dying, and I like to situate everything that I say in the cosmologies, the relationalities of my people, the materialities of my people. I come from the Yoruba people. You might know people from the Yoruba tribe. We are largely situated in Nigeria. And there is a concept that is core to how we think about the world. We call it Orita. And Orita literally translates into the place where the three roads meet. So it's the idea of the crossroads, the idea that nothing is still or stable, nothing is static. All bodies are ecstatic longings and desires and liminal and diasporic experimentations with an ongoing and open-ended universe. Right? So that's the concept of the crossroads. At the heart of the crossroads is a trickster that sits there, and this trickster, we call him, her, it, issue. And there's so many stories that can be told about issue. I wish I could hear your voices tell me about tricksters in your own traditions from wherever you're calling in the world. But issue is the Yoruba trickster, the most stubborn Orisha, the one who traveled with the slaves across the Atlantic, the one who is quite agential in creolizing the world. Right? There are many stories about the transatlantic slave trade that implicate issue as a major actor in that saga, and that his work isn't ended. Issue is still quite at work, especially in these times of new crossroads, the Anthropocene. So I situate my work heavily in this notion of the crossroads to signal a different ethics, to say that I'm not here to tell you truth. I'm not here to speak truth to power. I'm here to play. My play is of the urgent kind, the kind that invites us to slow down. My play is what makes the world. This playfulness is an invitation to think with errant thoughts, things that are transversal, that cut through time and space, especially those of us who are gestating in the city and in modern civilizations, and who have been taken by certain ways of glimpsing and performing the world. In these times of stuckness, we need tricksters. So I'm not here as a public intellectual to speak truth to power. I'm here as a trans-public intellectual to notice the ways the public is already haunted, and that we are itching and yearning and longing for other places of power beyond what the contemporary public might offer us. Okay? And I'd like to begin by invoking the words. Are you guys noticing my slides? They're pretty beautiful, if I might say so myself. There's a saying from Stacy Alaimo that the Anthropocene is no time to set things straight. Right? And I put that with, this image of toil and capture and death and slavery to situate a different story. I'd like to tell you 3 stories. So what I'm going to be doing in telling this idea or sharing this notion of a different notion of dying and how that might signal emancipatory politics of a different kind, I want to tell 3 stories. The first story is a half-remembered folk tale. I'm not even sure it has anything to do with the armadillo. It's the story of the armadillo that wanted to sing, but I'm not even sure if that's the protagonist in the story. One day my daughter wanted me to tell her a story, a bedtime story. And I usually make up stories when I put her to bed. And I run out of steam that day. I think I was so exhausted. So I downloaded this story and shared it with her. It was such a long time ago that I cannot quite recall what the animal was in this story, but I'm just going to use the armadillo. I've embellished it maybe to tell how the story ought to have gone or ought to go. And the second story is Pop Squad. I'll tell you more about that. And the last and final story is the Igbo landing of 1803. moving through these three stories and accounts and fictions and non-fictions, I hope to thread and embroider a, a different, the fabric of death that might suggest that death needs a new cosmology and that we need new ways of thinking about life that is not so distanced from dying and demise and compost and grief and loss. Well, let's get into it. This story is the story of an armadillo that desired more than anything else in the world to sing. And so the armadillo went to the bird and said, "Teach me how to sing. I will do anything to sing. I would give you my arms. I would give you my feet. I would give you my skin. Just teach me how to sing." And the bird, like birds do, said, "No, singing is strictly for the birds. It's not for you. Everyone knows that armadillos can't sing. No, I cannot teach you how to sing." And the armadillo was heartbroken, as you will probably be if someone were to shut the door so firmly on your passions. And so the armadillo wandered off and clambered into another ecology and met with the frog and said, "You croak so beautifully. Perhaps you could teach me how to croak that way. I do not mind. People say it's ugly, but you sing. It's singing to me. I need to know how to sing. Could you teach me how to sing?" And the frog said, "Nope, I wouldn't do that because everyone knows that armadillos can't croak and sing. I'm sorry, this is not for you." And the armadillo, twice broken, clambered off and went to another place and went to the bee, the bumblebee, and heard its buzzing and was so enraptured and enamored of that sound and said, "Please, bee, teach me how to buzz and hum the world into being in this way. Teach me. I would pay you anything." And you know how it went. I don't need to repeat it. Armadillos can't sing or buzz or croak. And so, thrice broken, the armadillo collapsed under the weight of its own passion and longing to sing, until a human, a carpenter, walked by and met the armadillo crying and said, "What seems to be the matter?" And the armadillo told the story of everyone it had met and the disappointments along the way. And the carpenter listened faithfully with great compassion and said, "I can teach you how to sing. I can give you that gift. But you would pay a huge price for it." "I don't mind. Teach me. I'm ready to pay anything for this to happen." And the carpenter said, "Well, you would have to pay with your life. You would have to die in order to sing." And the armadillo was taken by this story, by this offer, but did not for 1 second, second guess this contribution to its circumstance. It said, "Yes, my life is not worth as much as this desire to sing. I'm willing to do this." And so the carpenter took the armadillo and killed it, and took its flesh and its body and its hard exterior and exoskeleton, and fashioned it into a musical instrument of a strange sort, and played it. And the strangest and the most ethereal and the most fairy-like kind of music came from the armadillo's body. And the armadillo sang a beautiful song, and the birds and the bees and the frogs came and said, "What do you know? Armadillos can sing." Yeah. I remember telling this story to my daughter, and it brought tears to my eyes while she slept off. Because it was the tale of a different notion of dying that might be captured in this Yoruba proverb that says, "You must be willing to die in order to live." You must be willing to die in order to live. That there is a sense in which the armadillo story queers dying as a cessation of life, and disturbs and interrogates that notion that life is a property of living beings, a fixed property, static, unmoving, and that death is the disappearance of this quality. That there is a sense in which agency continues after the mark that designates where life ought to end. That there is a sense, a queer, strange sense that we continue. That the afterlife is already in the middle. That we are here together. And that maybe it is the performance of our modern, antiseptic, sterile, overly rational ways of seeing the world that demarcates life from death in a sure and confident way. Maybe there's something about the armadillo that teaches us that life is already hyphenated with death, and that we die 1,000 times in a way that escapes consciousness, but in a way that makes cognition vast and our bodies diasporic, wilder than the habitual ways we frame our bodies. And this feels like a good way to enter into a conversation about the troubles of today. That life feels more precious these times, doesn't it? What does the data say about the number of people who have died as a result of the pandemic? 5 million or so? 240 something million people infected, conservative figures, right? It seems we're turning inwards, doing all we can to protect life now. It seems even more fragile, precarious these days. And it's because of the pandemic, right? Suddenly there's a groundswell, an explosion of medical rituals to test for life. It's almost religious in the way that it shows up. You know, I've had my nose punctured or my nostrils invaded several times during my stay in Lisbon. It's that we're constantly searching for signs of infiltration and performing life as this immurement from exposure to the elements, viral, epidemiological, bacterial elements. You can say the same thing about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is how we mark death. Death to come. That we have so organized the planet to reflect our quest for transcendence that the planet might very well be defined by this activity. And so in our search for security, we've made ourselves vulnerable. And so the Anthropocene marks this place, this planetary cautionary ethic, this tale that it might not be long before peak oil renders us all vulnerable. It might not be too long right now when ocean acidification or rising levels of the sea troubles the stability of ground. In other words, we're not too far from death after all. The monster is approaching. And so you might, given that narrative, you might understand that the context of the citizen, the healthy citizen, is changing. Like I said, it's inoculation, it's vaccination, it's the narrative that we can get back to normal, the hope, the dream that we can restore the edges of our hubrisity and push the monsters to the edges as far as we can imagine, so that we can continue under whatever narrative, whatever sustainability as might be preached during COP26. We can push into the future, the colonized future that is ready and waiting for our constructs of permanence. But what do we miss when we try to get back to normal? And I love my spelling of back there, missing the K. What do we miss when we try to get back to normal? What is missing in pushing things outwards in our practices of health or well-being? And this brings me to our second story. It's called Pop Squad. This is an animated anthology that you might be able to watch on Netflix, depending on where you are in the world. The anthology is called Love, Death, and Robots. And I hear spoiling things is a bad thing. So if you don't want to know about this story, you can close your ears or just not listen to this part. But the Pop Squad is a Baldorian epic. You know the story of Baldur, the Norse mythology that tells the story of Freya, the goddess, who is the mother of Baldur, probably the most comely of all gods, who receives a prophecy that he's going to die. And Freya, in her anxiety, visits all the realms, basically, and extracts a promise from every single thing, human and non-human, God or non-God, thing, breathing, furniture, extracts a promise from every single thing that they would not harm her son, Baldur. And so Baldur is inoculated. He's quarantined from life itself. But she misses a spot, you see, and the spot is the mistletoe. And the story goes that Loki recruits another god to fire a mistletoe at Baldur at a game, and that's how Baldur dies, basically. I call it a Baldurian epic because the Pop Squad is about the question, what if we achieved final health? What if we were able to biologically induce immortality? And that's not such a far-fetched notion these days, with stories about Jeff Bezos experimenting with cryotechnologies, I think. Pop Squad imagines a world where that is possible, where with some drugs we can live forever, hundreds of years, stable. The problem with living forever is that if there's no dying, then the world will be quickly populated. And so this society, in this short story, this animated short story, enacts, control measures, basically banning the production of children. Reproduction becomes a crime in this story. So no one can give birth to kids. Of course, there are fugitive communities where people rear children and raise children, but to be caught is to be killed. Not just you, the violator, but the child or the children in question. And so this guy on my screen is called Detective Briggs, and he's just performed, he's just killed the child that they've located, but something happens. And I'm not going to tell you all the details. Something happens that disturbs him, that leaves him troubled by this act of violence. He's been doing this for many times. He's a veteran in killing children, right? Like cockroaches. But something about this event troubles him, and he sweats and he's constantly haunted by nightmares. And this leads into the final scene where he confronts a criminal, a mother who's raising a child in the shadows. And he asks this mother a question and says, why would you raise a child? Why would you do this? Why would you give up living forever in order to raise it? Of course, the mother shouts back and says, that's not an it, that's my daughter. But she says, I would rather live and die to witness and to celebrate my child and the joy in her face than to live forever. I've seen too much. I don't think my life is worth these moments with my children. And something happens that leads to the death of Detective Briggs. In that final moment, the director of the series of this short story wants us to see the glimpse of life in his eyes as this 800-year-old detective dies, suggesting that it's in that moment of dying that he truly lived. Like I would suggest that Baldur actually lived when he was struck by the mistletoe. So my questions, my people, are, if our bodies are caught up in certain productions of health that are stuck and imbricated, entangled with networks of suffering, what does it mean to be well? What does it mean to be well on a dying planet? The seditious glimpse of life in the heart of darkness is intriguing to me. But are there costs to being healthy? What are the costs to being well? If our bodies are diasporic, imbricated with the land ecologies, then can we say we are well in a way that cuts us off from what the world is doing? What is lost when health is performed in specific ways? What is given away? Just a few notes about the dominant narratives of today as we perform health as inoculation, vaccination, quarantine, constant diagnosis, going to the hospital, sticking out your tongue, showing your nostrils, wherever you land in the discussion about vaccination or vaccine hesitancy. I just gave a keynote about vaccine hesitancy at the New School in New York. And some of the things I'm sharing here are what I shared there as well. That the narrative, the dominant narrative is that vaccines save lives. And I just want to point out that there is no such thing as vaccines. That in a world that is entangled, a world that is rhizomatic, tentacular, there's only vaccine plus, right? Vaccine ... That is, vaccines are always implicated within a political order that deploys it for certain purposes. And I would suggest that ideological immurement is one way we are reinforcing a paradigm of health today. We are seemingly returning to a notion of health as an individual trait. The pandemic, as devastating as it was and still is, came with the troubling notion that my health is your health, that our bodies are inescapably entangled with one another. There's no way that I can speak about health that does not bring you into the conversation or bring ecology into the conversation. It was troubling. It induced a lot of suffering and dying, but there was a lesson in that suffering. I think the conversation about getting back to normal risks reinforcing the idea of returning to individualism, into a stable consumerism. Like, we're back to normal, we can get back to the shopping malls, we can do everything as we've always been doing them before. But it's also wanting to be said that the environmental consequences of mass vaccinations, are right there for us to see if we learn how to look. It's not just mass freezers. It's not just HFC, chlorofluoxin, I think it's called, which is heatier than carbon dioxide and has greater environmental impact than CO2. That is, the ways we freeze vaccines to transport them across the planet is adding and contributing to the Anthropocene. So this easy and convenient narrative that vaccines save lives, and they do save lives, right? But nothing emerges in the world without shadows. And we're examining the shadows here and troubling the straightforwardness of that narrative, right? So the quick solutionism, the ways we're rushing into getting back to normal, getting back to health, is troubling. It reinforces a metabolic corporeal order that is convenient for continuity and that gave birth to the crisis of the pandemic in the first place. Encroachment in ecologies, the idea that humans are supreme and exclusive and that we can do with the world whatever we want to do with the world. Those are troubling notions, and they're caught up with our practices of health today. So just to make things a bit clearer, from a liberal humanist perspective, health is the property of specific bodies, right? And sickness and death are matters from without, right? A virus comes from the wilds, right? Just like many mythopoetic understandings of the universe frame evil as the wilds. So the virus comes from the wilds and it invades our territories. Sickness and death are breaches of our membranes, the membranes of the individual, the membranes of the public. But this reductionistic idea of the virus as a point, right, in space-time is troubling. Because what it obscures is the way that a virus is not just some objective thing out there, but a political way of seeing the world. So from a different cosmovision, a relational, processual, entangling cosmovision, health is not owned. We don't own health or life, right? We can never fully contain it within our bodies. It is a swarm, a murmuration of agencies. It is a matter of ecology. It is a matter of closures and openings. In my culture, for instance, death was, and I say it was because that tradition is quickly dying because we're becoming educated, you see, and we're moving into the city, and the city has its imperatives. Death was seen as something to be celebrated. When a person lived well, it was to be celebrated. It was a time of mourning, yes, because it was a time of loss. But death was not seen as a cessation of life, but as the queering of continuity. So we have names like Babatunde, right, which means father has come again. A grandfather has come again. Or Iyewande, which is my sister's name, which is grandmother has come back again. There was something about life that needed death to be lively. And there's something about death that was always implicating life. Right? So from that perspective, the pandemic is not a virus outside invading us. The pandemic is how we respond to the virus. The pandemic is the rituals, the agencies, the nation state, the files passing through institutions, the World Health Organization, the names, the media, Facebook, social networks. It's an assemblage of responses. It's an assemblage of intelligences. It's not just something coming from without to invade a neat interior. Instead, it is an organization of responsibilities and responsivities. Because bodies are not stable, static things. Bodies are ecstatic. Bodies are processes, right? Distended through space-time. It is in this way that I dare say that sickness is not natural in the terms of being outside of artifact. in the sense of being non-political, ahistorical, essentially biological or psychological. Sickness is manufactured, is organized. I would invite you to pick up the book by my sister called Inflamed. Patel and Rupa wrote that book, and it's basically about how certain bodies, especially minorities, experience the pandemic in more grievous ways than their white counterparts. And that sickness is not just what affects the body, sickness is a certain arrangement, a certain social arrangement that inflames, right? That makes certain bodies proximate to disease and to suffering, and others immune from that. So it is impossible under these circumstances to see sickness as something that we glimpse in a microscope. It is more than that. It is theological, it is political, it is gastronomical, it is bacterial, it is archetypal. So to be healthy is not a determination. It's not something we accidentally come across. It's not something that precedes the ways we talk about it. It is a social production, right? It is real. I'm not saying it's not real, right? I'm saying the real is fabricated. The real is made, right? Not by humans alone, but by non-humans. We are in a nexus, an ongoing co-participatory saga of making the world and making the universe what it is. It's no one's intention, no one is centralized. So health and sickness are caught up in certain modes and imperatives that privilege certain political ideas and agendas. In that sense, healthy people are manufactured. What it means to be well, what it means to get a clean bill of health is already an ideological stance, is already a perpetuation of a certain notion, a cosmo-perception of the world and what it means to be human in that world. And finally, I would suggest that dying is also a cosmovision. And this is not new. There's nothing novel about saying that death is different across cultures. There's not a singular thing called death. There's nothing monolithic called death. How we practice death in the city is erasure, is dismissal, it's burial. But there is a sense in which death spills out within different epistemological contexts, within different ecological contexts, within different archetypal contexts. Death is different. And so I think death needs a new cosmology. That the ways we practice death today is, like I've said variously, caught up in the ways that we have become stuck. Because I don't know about you, I don't want to return to normal. The normal didn't work for many of us. The normal was already a trope of death and suffering. The itch to return to the familiar, to return to the consumerism that gave birth to the Anthropocene, to return to the industrialization of our ecologies, the co-opting and the extraction and the displacement, just like bodies taken across the Atlantic. That normal, it needs a breach. It needs a break. I need a break. Most of us do, I think. And so, to wrap things up, I would introduce the concept of the Afro scene to hold the last story and to invite different notions of what it might mean to treat death as inquiry, as research, as end-time cartography, instead of the thing waiting for us at the end of the line, the thing waiting for us at the end of our modern subjectivity, right? I don't want to say too much about the Anthropocene. except to say that it has the effect of re-centralizing the human as an independent actor, right? And what that does is to cut us off from ecology. As useful as its analysis is to say, we need to take care of what we're doing to the planet, it doesn't quite do well in noticing the legacies that led to this moment. And so there's a tendency to rush to solutions as resolutions. There's a tendency to centralize human agency as exceptional. There's a tendency to elide, obscure the legacies of capture and slavery. And it's because of these legacies that I've offered to the conversation the notion of the Afro-scene. The Afro-scene. And the way that I see the Afro-scene is not just the African Anthropocene, even though there's something beautiful about that conceptualization as well, but that the Afro-scene is that which haunts the Anthropocene. I think of the Anthropocene as a slave ship, that we all are still in this slave ship, that the slave ship never really, whether you are part of a historical slave community or not, the transatlantic slave trade gave birth to the global order and the economy of nation states that we have today. Right? And so we are implicated in it somehow. And that all of us are still participating in that structure. Right? I feel the Anthropocene is the slave ship, and that we haven't disembarked. And that the slave ship never really disappeared. Instead, the slave ship became the shore. Right? It didn't quite arrive at the shore as much as it became the shore. Right? And it spilled its guts into the shore. And it gave the shore, its gifts. Its gifts of hierarchy, its gifts of trauma, its gifts of death as containment, and life as control, and human as exceptional, and black bodies, for instance, as resource and prop for the white body. And so the Afro-scene, what does it do? It drags the Anthropocene down to watery depths, because the Afro-scene is the crack in the body of the slave ship. It cracks open the slave ship. And I think what we're trying to do today, including with COP26 right now, which my brother was saying something about a while ago, is to try to patch up everything, is to try to put things back to normal, is to try to get the slave ship roaming again, right? So everyone's hands on deck, we're trying to resume sailing, right? But there is a sense in which the crack, that chasma graphic point in the slave ship is an invitation to lose our way. My people say, in order to find your way, you must be willing to lose it. Just like they say, the same trickstery people say that you have to lose your life in order to actually live well. Right? That there's a crack in the body of our modern arrangements right now. And through this crack is a different notion of death. Through this crack is a different notion of dying. Through this crack is a different assemblage of life that does not make us immune from the elements, that does not invite us to immure ourselves, to incarcerate ourselves within holding cells of the modern. That is not a roundabout way of speaking about quarantine and vaccination. I actually celebrated that. I felt we needed that in some sense. But the point here is that we're caught up in these practices of health making, which is a form of world making and place making. And I think in doing that, whatever your intentions or conceptualizations, something exceeds our good, intentions, and is helping us, create a world that is stuck in this paradigm of health, a paradigm that is already poisonous. So the Afro-scene is an invitation to gods, to principalities, to bacchanal aesthetics, as Lovelace would call it, to monstrosities, ways of seeing our bodies as not as coherent as the city would have us believe it is, right? ways of thinking that the way we respond to crisis is part of the crisis. The Afro-scene is the gift of failure. I think that's my point. The Afro-scene is the gift of breach and failure. It's a portal to, not a guarantee, but a possible portal to other ways of conceptualizing well-being on the planet. And I'm not here to offer you that on a platter of gold, to say this is the answer, but to offer an invitation to inquiry through failure, through moments when things don't add up, as the city would teach us with their arithmetic. So to think through the Afro scene, we need to think beyond the ways we think about well-being and health and vaccines and harm. Sometimes we think of harm as the geometric progression from an already identified perpetrator to a victim. Right? Instead of thinking about harm beyond the human, post-humanist, an animist sense of harm that says harm is the political, it's the crisscrossing tensions and intensities, almost atmospheric, that leads us in certain directions, like zombie ants, right? We are caught up in certain practices of perpetuating suffering, even with our good intentions. And it is with that that I offer the idea of the Afro scene as a crack in the slave ship. And these questions: would you save the slave ship from drowning? Is there some other way we can think about what it means to be here without trying to escape our circumstances, without perpetuating white modernity over and over again? I think I've said something about this. I don't need to repeat this. I'm dancing from here to there, but it might be good to read it. In the Afro scene, health in the city is a matter of colonial elisions. It's no less ideological than a manifesto. And the coronavirus has never been a still, static entity outside. It's rhizomatic. In the Afro scene, we're being invited to see ourselves as beside ourselves, right? We're like ghosts. We're no longer citizens in these troubling times. We are ghosts. And I don't know what the health of a ghost looks like. Let me end with my final story that might congeal these ideas. It's the Igbo landing of 1803, and this is the account of 70-something bodies, 74, 75, or 76, I cannot recall, bodies stolen from the Bight of Benin, present-day Nigeria. The Igbo people are part of eastern Nigeria. These bodies were stolen across the Atlantic and taken to Georgia at Dunbar Creek. Along the way, just before they disembarked, the slaves mounted an insurgency and took control of the ship. But it was only for a brief moment, because those who escaped to the shore, those who were not captured by the slaves, brought reinforcements. And those reinforcements came with a threat of capture. And so it is said, and this is a story that is such a powerful heart of my contributions. It's such a powerful story in the African diasporic communities, in the Caribbean, in the Americas. Why? And I'll tell you why. Because rather than risk capture, rather than give their bodies to the labor of the plantation, the 74, 75, 76 slaves, men, women, children, formed a single line and walked straight into the waters, singing an ancestral song. I wish I could sing it if I knew the words. But the translation into English is Chukwu, the God that is favored by Igbo people. Chukwu, the supreme God, brought us here. Chukwu will take us back home. And so they walked straight into the waters. Some of them were dragged out, but most of them drowned. From a colonial perspective, this is a tragedy, the largest suicide certainly at those times. And one plantation owner literally wrote in his diary, they walked into the waters, they drowned. Basically, it was as simple as that, a waste of economic resources. But from the Afro-scenic perspective, this dying was more than what meets the eye. There was something about this that became archetypal, mysterious, invoking, conjuring notions of a death that is not quite as terminal as the city believes it is. Because it is said, and it is transferred from whisper to whisper, hush to hush, that these bodies actually transmutated into birds and flew across the Atlantic and arrived home. And elders still tell the story of their transmutation, of turning into animals, of becoming animal. You might say that's stupid. Obviously, that didn't happen. I don't know what is stupid anymore in a time where everything is topsy-turvy. I'm generally reluctant or hesitant to limit the stupid to that which is not rational. I think stupidity is generated in ways that sanity will not be able to detect. And so I don't want to rule this out. I'm drawn to the idea of becoming animal as a way of responding to a health that is imbricated with suffering, to a paradigm of individuality that situates well-being as the furniture of continuity. This refusal, this fugitive refusal is, I suppose, my life's work today. The aesthetic of the insensible, of the invisible, is the decolonial. And the decolonial is the question: if your health and your well-being is already your sickness and caught up in this toxic cyclicity, what do you need to do, or what do you need to know to exit that cyclicity? So these are final points for me, that we're stuck in a cycle of death and health that preserves the conditions of suffering. We are practicing notions of death that leaves us like Detective Briggs, caught up in a life, maybe not as extensive or durational as that fictional character's life, but no less troubling in its costs, the ontological costs of being a citizen upon this planet. Right? So I suggest that it might take a certain kind of practice of fugitive refusal, a zigzagging through the world, an inquiry that might begin from failure, from all of us asking ourselves questions like, where have we noticed a gift even within suffering? Is there a kernel of truth or reward or treasure or prosperity or abundance even within the circumstances of oppression? Are there cracks in the narrative of health that we can share with one another? Stories of failure. And what do we do in these cracks? But that's a matter for another keynote. But I'll end here. That if death continues to center the human, then I think we'll continue to build cities and monuments to our exceptionality. And before long, what it means to be dead, and what it means to be alive, what it means to be healthy, and what it means to be sick will be indistinguishable from each other. And we're already heading there in empire in our efforts to stamp our presence permanently on the planet. So I invite us to performances of cracks, to compostographies, places of dying well, practices of listening to the planet, practices of listening to ourselves, practices of assembly, where we share with one another the renegade fugitive sciences and ways of being on the planet that may not be amenable to citizenry, but is probably an opening to other questions and other performances of well-being. it might take a certain kind of dying for us to really take heed of these words, that the times are urgent, we must slow down, or else we risk being lost in a world that is completely found. I think I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bayo. If we were in a room together, you'd hear all the clapping, but so I just have to thank you on behalf of everyone, because Hopin doesn't allow them to leap onto the stage and thank you themselves. But that was really, really powerful, moving talk, and brought together lots of themes, I think, that we've been discussing over the past year. And it particularly threw me back. I think you and Dougald Hine know each other, don't you? You
Oh, yeah, dear brother. Yes, yes.
Really a dear friend of many of us here, and had many good conversations with him. And Dougald, as I said in the intro, really, in many ways, he started this cycle off, or we started this cycle of conversations off by inviting Dougald to Cornwall, where he gave 2 talks around this idea he was working with at the time, which he called negotiating the surrender of our way of life. And it was interesting how it became quite controversial. It produced who's the we, those kind of. But it's a really, really valuable, powerful talks. And something you said really reminded me of an idea he said there that stuck with me ever since, which is, he was talking in the context of Brexit and Trump, and this strange inability, this kind of weakness you could sense around the forces of conservatism. That, in other words, the Remainers here in Britain, or Democrats in America. And the sort of faltering loyalty to keeping things the way they were, the faltering sense of investment in this carrying on, and I just, as you were talking, I was thinking about COP, and I was thinking, which you mentioned, and obviously the discourse around that, sorry, this is turning into a long question, but the discourse around that fills our ears, that I don't want to distance myself from, is one of greed, vested interests, the obscenity of a generation visiting a kind of intercontinental and intergenerational crime on that sort of enormous magnitude. So that kind of language is very powerful. But I wondered if there's another way of looking at it that I don't have clear in my head at all, but that what we're really witnessing is a strange passivity, which isn't, maybe it's not just reducible to greed, maybe what you're speaking about is this, why isn't anyone invested in, why aren't people more invested in acting with a kind of speed and dynamism that would appear to be essential to then choose survival? I don't know if that wrapped itself up into a question or not.
It kind of did. I don't know if this is a direct response to that, but this is how I feel invited to show up to that. I think it was French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and his counterpart, his friend, a psychiatrist, that posed the question: what if we are caught up in territories of wanting that preserve the status quo? I mean, the question was, why do people call upon or call for their own imprisonment? Why do we enact, in our quest for freedom, why do we enact incarceration, right? Why are we so committed to totalitarianism, right? And I think their response to it is insightful, that wanting has never been a human thing. Desire transcends and exceeds the human. In other words, it is not us that desires as such, it is desire that enlists us in its movement. Capitalism, for instance, and I don't need to pathologize even capitalism, But capitalism enacts some kind of eatable construct that keeps us in circles, right? So their desire becomes trapped. For instance, in the family, right? Desire becomes trapped between mommy, daddy, and me. So this triangular affair, and desire becomes trained to please daddy, or to celebrate mommy and to try to pacify daddy, something like that, something Freudian in that sense, or psychodynamic. It's maybe that's the sense in which we are stuck in getting back to normal, Matt. That we don't know what else to do. That we are doing our best, we're doing the best we can, but we really the only way we think about well-being is let's get back to the way it was before. Let's restore a sense of the familiar, because this instability is unnerving, and so let's get things back to normal. And I think, of course, like you said, the democratic world in the United States, for instance, is championing that, and now accusing, of course, the Republicans of doing the things that they found uproarious and horrible not too long ago. Right? You're not listening. You're not thinking for yourselves, but they are also not thinking for themselves. No one is thinking for themselves. I'll put it this way, brother, that I think for me, the signs in the train stations in London are right. We have to mind the gap. The idea is not to jump on the train. The idea is to mind the gap. I think there's something theoretically significant about that. Literally attend to what's in the gap. Look at the cracks. There's life there. In the places that modernity has learned to flatten over, in order to get back to normal. In the places we've learned to put a band-aid upon, there's life. So we need to mind the gap. We need to pay mind to the cracks. But where are these cracks? There's sites of failure. There's sites of spatio-temporal opening. There are places where our bodies are doing things that the narratives that have been imposed upon us tell us you're not supposed to do, right? I've heard stories of people who are in deep forms of sickness, and they say, I can now see from a certain perspective that was not possible if I was well. We have to dismantle the threads, the embroidery of the normal, right? But it's not left entirely to us. The only way we can do this sometimes, I feel, without repeating the familiar, like probably our Democratic and Republican brothers and sisters are doing, is to situate ourselves within the cracks, is to stay with the troubles of this moment, is to not be so quick to heal the wounds, because the wounds are portals. That's the only way, I think, to play with and experiment with other ways of being in the world.
It's really, really helpful, and I think it ripples out into lots of other themes within this conversation, including those of us, I don't mean me personally, but those among us I know who are bringing their testimony or their witness of living with chronic illness as well.
Yes.
Illness that can't be simply solved, and in many ways that bring, as Sophie Strand talked about beautifully in her talk with Richard about in our most recent conversation, that it brings a very specific insight into what's happening, the experience of somebody whose body has a malaise of some kind that can't be shaken off. I've got about 6 questions of my own stacked from just your answer to that one, but I'm going to be a good chair and we've got some good questions coming in now. So I'm going to start with Jess Langton. Jess asks, Bayo, you talk about breaking the cycle of how we think about solutions is, of course, part of the problem. Do you think we should just accept with grace the time we've had and not try to fix the future?
No. I don't think it's a should, question. I don't think there's an oughtness to this. We want to pay attention to the ways that agency is, that we're not exclusive or exceptional agents doing things on our own. We do with every doing or acting is an acting with. There is a sense in which the city will not stop sitting, Matt, right? Modernity will not stop modernizing. It wants to do that. But the thing is, in my analysis, even the city longs for its own disruption, right? Just like the slave plantation performed fugitivity in a sense. So I don't see things good and evil that way, right? In a sense, the fugitive escaping the plantation was an extension of the plantation, just like a rhizome, just sprouting new roots. It wasn't a disconnection, it wasn't a pure disassembly. It was still the plantation yearning for its own otherwise. I feel that the city and our modern assemblage of solutionisms, will continue to solution. We'll continue to do COP26, there'll be COP27, COP28, and we'll be copying all night long and still, it's like we've been doing this in the 1970s. If we're to privilege the topic of climate, we've been doing this since the 1970s, and we're going to continue doing this for a long while. But I think even in the extensions of continuity, there are breakages, there are ruptures, there are places where things do not add up. And we occupy those places all the time, not with the same effect, but we have experiences that we've learned to repress or push out or explain away, such as The Devil Made Me Do It. I think The Devil Made Me Do It would be the title of my third book or fourth book, right? Because there's so much hiding there that we did not talk about that is unlanguageable, right? So to answer that question, if I could, I don't think we can just summarily stop. I don't think stoppage will be a performance of some kind, right? Even a pause is performative. I think, however, that the colonial is never as fully totalizing as we think it is. That there's a small spark that is left, a smile in Auschwitz, a thing that cannot be contained. And it is there that we have to form a new politics in.
Fantastic. That's one of the themes we've been talking about during the sort of run up to this is how we understand hope, and that feels like a lovely way of approaching that idea would be that the project can never succeed. That it's always got the crack, the thing.
Yeah.
Therein paradoxically is the hope. Thanks, Bayo. I have another question for you from Maria Rene. Maria asks, Bayo, if we as a collective are sitting at the crossroads, how might we interact with the tricksters? What do we need to carry with us? What questions should we be asking? Where should our attention be?
There's something beautiful about that statement. The times are urgent, let us slow down. When people hear that and they believe I'm telling them to literally reduce speed or to do yoga more often or to go on vacation, then I like to point out that slowing down on the highway doesn't mean you're not still heading in the same direction. What use is slowing down if I'm still heading the same way? It's not slowing down in terms of speed. It's slowing down in terms of what we centralize and what we bring into the room. Slowing down is a function of crossroads, not highways, right? And crossroads are known or popular for doing monstrous things, right? The crossroad is the paradigm of the monstrous because bodies are never stable in the crossroads. The crossroads is where things interact with each other, where molecules crash into molecules. So if we sit at the crossroads, it means we are performing a politics of monstrosity. It means we think about decoloniality as listening to that which we've demonized, that which we've pathologized, a way of approaching the world that decenters the human. I've given this example, I gave it in a talk today. I spoke about huitlacoche. Huitlacoche is a delicacy in Mexico, but it is also a fungal pathogen. It's a plant disease that grows on corn, and that is now a delicacy, a dish. I'm very interested in the point, at which a disease becomes a dish, right? That is the interaction or interactional abundance of the world, right? That things do not proceed on neat trajectories, that the world is constantly making and unmaking itself. Right? So a politics that is premised on that is a politics that is not about recognition, about showing up, about excellence, about being healthy in the way that the city defines it. It's about us interrogating what health might mean. It's about us, offering our sicknesses to the altar of inquiry, collective inquiry. It's about us asking questions that were not possible before. This pandemic has taught me, for instance, things about my son who is on the autistic spectrum. We don't use that language in my family. We prefer neuroemergence. That things I couldn't have known about him if I approached him from the usual ways that I was trained as a psychologist or as a psychotherapist. I'm meeting my son as a disruption of the normal, right? As a disruption of stability or typicality or sanity. I now realize that we need different kinds of subjectivities, different kinds of bodies to meet a world that is agentially vibrant. And that sanity is a disability, Matt. It's becoming a disability. Health is becoming a disability in the Anthropocene. So we need to find ways of falling down to earth. Yeah.
That's very, very powerful idea. It's also, of course, one of the things that's been really celebrated about extraordinary Greta Thunberg, which she brings us, among other things, the gift of the neurodiverse, the gifts of the neurodiverse are affirmed, as with many others. Also, your reply there really, it took, the first time I ever encountered your voice was in a YouTube version. I think there's several of the times are urgent, let us slow down. And you spoke there about eloquence. I think you put it that way. And that if people rock up to this conversation about the Anthropocene with a kind of spring in their step, confident in their ability to eloquently speak to it, you'd rather they went away faltering in their speech or with a limp. That kind of idea really stuck with me, and that sense that as the sense of crisis intensifies, the essays get longer and more frequent, and somehow in our striving for insight and lucidity, there's something equivalent to what you were talking about in seeking health, in the sort of weaponization of health. I'm gonna resist framing that as a proper question because I want to go to my. I've got a stack of questions here, and I feel I should. Thank you, my dear colleague. It's just shown me how to control the screen in front of me, where the questions are coming through. So I wanted to scroll back down to bring one that I think also offers a way into that similar territory from June. June says, Bayo, how far do we need to restore the intuitive as a source of truth in our post-enlightenment culture?
Well, our ways of making knowledge now does not leave too much room for the intuitive. I don't know how many people here are PhDs, but if you've gone through that tunnel, that rite of passage, it's a long way of telling you that your expertise, your ability to create knowledge is based upon your adherence to external factors, not that has been determined by a certain political order, because science is political, right? And that, my grandmother's teachings, a goat herder in India, and the proverbs that spill from my father continually and my people who didn't have PhDs is to be dismissed, is not worth anything, right? During the pandemic in Kerala, a state in India, some women came to the beach and they built an altar and they put biscuits and sweets and toffee and stuff and stuck it into this altar. And they consecrated this altar to the Corona goddess, right? The Corona goddess. I am pretty sure that lots of people will look at that and say, that's horrible, that's nonsensical. I mean, it's innocent, it's positively harmless, but it has no significance to a world that is suffering right now. We need real results, you know. And this idea of real results, getting back to business, getting back to normal, is the reductionism again. It's the isolation of the virus that treats the virus as a pathogen exclusively, a point in Euclidean space, instead of an archetypal, theological, rhizomatic entity that can be approached in an archetypal form or way. But we still inhabit a world where the dominant way of thinking is to privilege expertise, is to privilege distance from ourselves, right? The further away you are from your language, from your context, from your own, from the materialities of your being, the more you know. I think that might change as I don't know that the nation state can accommodate intuition as a form of knowing, but I think we don't need scale to make worlds, right? We need cracks to make worlds. All we need to do is situate ourselves in those cracks and share recipes with one another. I don't believe that there is such a thing, a container term like the world, an umbrella term within which we can create scales, the macro and the micro. That's a very convenient way of situating things. Especially now, Matt, when a small thing, supposedly like the virus, upended entire economies. What scale, what size anymore, right? So I feel deeply that intuition is already with us. We already have intuitive, beautiful ways of knowing, divinatory forms of knowledge making, other sensory patterns of cavorting with the wilds. We just need those spaces to perform that. And as modernity hollows out and the architecture crumbles, it might be more available than usual.
That's a beautiful response. And, we've got a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if this last question, if we just snuck in one more question from Mark.
Okay, one more question.
Mark's asked a question that is, I'm going to kind of ride on the back of the question I wanted to close with, and maybe your answer to these can be, maybe in many ways you've spoken to this much already, but Mark asks, could you say more about your thoughts on the possibilities of art and myth in reconfiguring death, life, health? And if it's okay, Mark, to just ride on the back of your question there, I'm really aware that although I kind of read non-fiction addictively, I think the paranoid reading, as it's sometimes called, trying to dig deeper and deeper into the hole, it's usually novelists and poets that really help. And I wondered if in your address to Mark's question, I'd love to hear, are there any particular artists, poets, storytellers who really help you speak to you? I'm thinking as I say that of the really interesting collaboration you've been doing with an illustrator whose name I'm sorry not to have in my hand, but I know who you worked with on iCoronavirus. Anyway, I'll stop extending the question there.
I love the question about art because I think art only thrives during unsettlement, when things are unsettled. That art doesn't thrive on surfaces. Surface art is furniture. Art really comes alive when there are cracks in the terrain, right? So art, you must have heard of Adam's event. You've heard of that, Matt?
Of what, sorry?
Adam's event, Adam's geomagnetic event.
No, I
This
haven't
is
heard of that. No,
this is a polar reversal that hypothetically happened 42,000 years ago, named after Douglas Adams because of his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and his proposal that the answer to everything is the number 42. Right?
I have heard of the polar reversal, so that, I haven't heard it called that. Brilliant.
Well, for some time, we never thought that had any real effect. Then some recent analysis, especially of trees in New Zealand, supposedly tells the story that there was a major one 42,000 years ago that changed everything. Solar radiation came crashing through the clouds, burning up stuff, driving human populations to subterranean depths. Right? Now, what's interesting about that story is that it coincides with the eruption of art, like cave art, handprints and what? Yes, Paleolithic forms, basically. It coincided with that around the world. I feel art is a response to crisis, and art is how the world comes to world itself. That art is what is curating politics right now. And science, science is a form of art. It's not a foundational knowledge-making practice. It is a form of art making. So we do need an aesthetic, a way of gathering ourselves, a way of experimenting with play that is artistic. Poetry. I think poetry is the spirituality of the apocalypse, is the language of the apocalypse. That end times need poetry more than precision, right? Because cracks need something, another different form. The cracks need the eloquence of gasps more than the language of correctness. And so we need poets today. We need dancers who can disappoint the image of static bodies and tell us just in movement that our bodies are more fluid than we think they are. And I'm reading people like Chinua Achebe over and over again. Ursula Le Guin is a wonderful inspiration in these times. George Orwell in 1984 to remind me that fascism can appear in different forms, right? Even with good intentions. The archetypal patterns are there, and it can appear in, without the same image we're used to, but it can show up. And yeah, I'm at least those three principles. I can't think of any at this moment. Maybe because my brain and my belly are tired. but yeah, I feel this is art. This is a moment for art. Not that any moment isn't a moment for art, but we especially need performative art. We especially need the queerness of art to help us travel, to help us shapeshift, to help us become birds.
That feels like a lovely kind of assignment or mission to send people away with at an Ecology and Arts Summit as we wrap up. So I just want to say to Bayo, I just want to say a deep thanks from all of us. I can't think of a better way we could have started our 3 days. I'm really grateful for it. So yeah, thank you. Good luck with the second iteration of We Dance with Mountains.
It's actually the 5th.
Sounds wonderful, and I know there'll be some here who are with you there, watching it with great interest. And to everyone else, I just want to say we're going to have a short break, but don't disappear, because we're then going to return to the main stage for Beatrice Alagrante's film. So do come back in 16 minutes. Bye, thank you. I'll say goodbye.